The old pickup rattled up the dirt road, Montana wind sweeping through fields as wide and gold as the sky. Emily Thompson sat in the back seat, knees hugged to her chest, her battered sketchbook wedged like a shield between chin and arms. She hadn't spoken since the funeral. The world had turned silent, not just for her, but inside her too. All the things she used to say were now trapped in pictures and lines, poured quietly onto paper with a graphite pencil. When the truck finally crunched to a stop in front of the weathered sign, Horizon Hills Sanctuary, Emily's new life felt even farther away than the one she'd lost. Her grandfather Jack climbed down first. He looked like he'd been carved out of the land. Broad shoulders, sun-darkened skin, hands rough as saddle leather. He waited, patient, as she slid out, clutching her sketchbook tighter. The sanctuary didn't look like much at first. A scattering of faded barns, fence lines stretching into the distance. The clean air threaded with the scent of hay and horses. But to Emily, everything pulsed with tension. The ground brittle underfoot. The wind too loud. There was a hush here. Not the peaceful kind, but the sort that comes from too many things left unsaid. A sharp clang echoed across the paddocks, breaking the uneasy silence. Jack jerked his chin toward a corral on the far edge of the property. Guess he's letting you know you're not the only new face. Emily followed him, boots dragging in the dust, until she saw the horse, a Mustang, wild-eyed and restless. His coat a stormy brown, mane tangled and dark. He circled the corral, flanks tense, scarred, tossing his head at the man inside with him. The man, Charlie, the ranch hand, held out a halter. In a flash of muscle, the Mustang spun and lashed out, hooves crashing into the wooden gate. The whole fence shuddered. Emily flinched, heart leaping. For a moment, she and the horse locked eyes, his gaze wild, hers haunted. Something flickered, a brief, searching recognition. Jack put a gentle hand on her shoulder. That's Rust. Came in last month. You see those scars? Some wounds run deeper than skin. Emily stared at the horse, fingers unconsciously tracing the rough outline of his shape on her sketchbook's cover. The Mustang snorted, nostrils flaring, and backed into the corner, eyes never leaving her. Emily wondered if he was angry or just afraid. Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe they weren't so different after all. Jack crouched beside her, voice low. He don't trust anybody yet. Don't blame him. But here, he gestured to the wide open fields and the sharp blue mountains looming in the distance. We give things time. Sometimes all you can do is wait. Evening fell hard in Montana, shadows stretching long across the sanctuary. Emily stood by the window in her new room, sketchbook open, listening to the horses shift in their stalls. She pressed her pencil softly to the page, drawing the wild Mustang's eyes, fierce but uncertain. Her own eyes reflected back in the glass, red and tired. The house itself felt full of ghosts. Every floorboard creak, every soft wicker from the barn seemed to carry old pain. Emily wandered the hallway, studying faded photographs of riders and horses. Her grandfather as a young man, dusty rodeos, ribbons pinned to jackets. She traced the lines of a photo where a little girl, smiling and fearless, perched on a pony. That was her mother, years before. Emily touched the glass, wishing she could draw herself back in time, erasing the jagged lines that separated then from now. Downstairs, Jack brewed tea he never drank, busying himself with chores long after sunset. He didn't ask Emily to talk, didn't press her for answers. Instead, he left a mug on the table, slid a plate of sliced apples beside her sketchbook. and went out to check the fences. The quiet between them was awkward, but kind. Outside, the wind picked up, sending ripples through the grass. Emily sat on the porch steps, apple in hand, sketchbook balanced on her knees. She listened, not for words, but for the soft music of hooves and distant thunder. Rust paced the far fence, tail swishing, eyes fixed on the horizon. Emily sketched him again, her pencil moving in slow, careful strokes. As night deepened, a hush fell over Horizon Hills. Emily watched the Mustang through the window, saw the way he pressed his forehead against the gate, as if testing its strength, as if daring the world to come closer. She felt the familiar ache inside her chest, longing for something lost, and fear of what might come next. The first day ended with a single look, a girl and a horse, both broken, both wary, for an instant, as their eyes met across the darkening paddock. The silence between them didn't feel quite so heavy. There was a flicker, a question unspoken. Could two wounded things ever learn to trust again? Emily closed her sketchbook, heart pounding, and crawled into bed, listening to the hush outside. The sanctuary was still, but in that stillness, hope stirred, fragile and real, the faintest promise that maybe, just maybe, healing could begin. Morning in Montana came cold and bright, the sun spilling gold over the hills and the sanctuary's weathered barns. Emily woke to the low calls of horses, the distant clank of a gate, and the soft clatter of boots on the porch. She moved quietly, pulling on her old canvas jacket, sketchbook pressed to her chest, as if it might shield her from whatever this day might bring. Jack was already outside, his breath misting in the cool air as he loaded hay into wheelbarrows. He looked up, gave her a nod, then gestured toward the far paddock. Thought maybe you'd like to sit near Russ today. Just be around him a little. No one's gonna make you talk. His voice was gentle, unhurried, the kind of calm that didn't ask for anything in return. Emily followed the gravel path to Rust's paddock, her steps careful, slow. The Mustang stood at the far end, his body drawn tight, muscles shifting under a coat burnished like autumn leaves. He watched her, ears pinned flat, the wariness in his gaze almost electric. Emily settled on the grass several feet from the fence, legs folded beneath her, sketchbook open on her lap. At first, Rust wouldn't look at her, pacing along the fence line, snorting softly, his tail flicking in agitation. Emily tried to focus on the curve of his shoulder, the wild mane blown by the wind. Her pencil danced in quick, nervous lines, until suddenly, the lead snapped with a sharp crack. Rust jerked, eyes wide, hooves scrambling in the dirt. Emily's hand flew to her mouth, breath caught in her throat. Her sketchbook slipped from her lap, landing face down in the grass. For a moment, neither moved. The air pulsed with tension. Then, slowly, Emily reached for her book, careful not to make a sound. Rust stared at her, nostrils flared, the whites of his eyes showing. She sat perfectly still, waiting until his breathing eased and he retreated to the far side of the paddock, head low, tail lashing. Jack watched from the barn, arms crossed, eyes thoughtful. He knew this was how it had to start, not with big, sweeping gestures, but with quiet, patient presence. "You don't force a Mustang," he'd told her. "You earn every inch." The day stretched out, the hours marked by small, cautious encounters. Emily drew Rust in dozens of poses, grazing, ears flicked, head tossed high at a sudden gust. She noticed the little things, how his ears twitched at every sound, how his eyes tracked her every movement, never blinking, never softening. By late afternoon, the air had grown warmer, shadows stretching long across the fields. Emily's hand ached from drawing, her page covered in sketches of Rust's restless form. She felt the hunger of his loneliness in every line, saw her own fear mirrored back in the uncertain strokes. She thought about leaving, but something in Rust's stance, the way he hovered near the fence, not quite turning away, held her there. Reaching into her jacket pocket, Emily found an apple Jack had given her with lunch. She studied the slice, feeling the stickiness on her fingers, the way the light glinted off the juice. With a steady breath, she stood and walked to the fence, heart pounding in her chest. She placed the apple slice on the post, then retreated a few steps, sitting back down cross-legged on the grass. Rust lifted his head, ears pricked forward. He sniffed the air, eyes fixed on the offering. The sanctuary fell silent, as if the world itself was holding its breath. For a long minute, nothing happened. Then, slowly, almost reluctantly, Rust edged toward the fence, one cautious hoof at a time. His head lowered, nostrils flaring as he examined the apple. He hesitated, glancing once at Emily, amber eyes burning with suspicion. Then, in a quick, nervous motion, he grabbed the apple in his teeth, tossing his head as he chewed. For the briefest moment, his gaze met Emily's. The connection was fragile but real, a flicker of recognition, a question whispered across the distance. Jack watched from the shadows of the barn, a smile twitching beneath his weathered mustache. He didn't say a word, but in his eyes there was hope. Hope that maybe, for the first time since Emily's arrival, something had shifted. The sun began to set, painting the sky with streaks of pink and gold. Emily sat quietly, heart full and trembling, watching Rust linger by the fence. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. So she did the only thing she could. She drew him over and over, the lines bolder now, the distance between them just a little smaller. As the last light faded, Emily packed up her things and headed for the house. Rust watched her go, ears tilted in her direction. She glanced back, offering a shy, uncertain smile. For the first time since the accident, the heaviness in her chest felt a little lighter. Inside, Jack set a plate of stew on the table, then ruffled her hair as she passed. "You did good, kid," he murmured, voice thick with emotion. "Sometimes, all it takes is a little bit of patience and a slice of apple." That night, as Emily lay in bed, she replayed the moment in her mind. The way Rust had inched closer, the brush of connection sparking in the space between their pain. She traced the memory with her pencil, sketching by the faint glow of her bedside lamp, filling the page with hope. Outside, under a bowl of stars, Rust stood at the fence, his breath steaming in the cool night air. He gazed at the house, at the window glowing softly in the dark. And for the first time, he didn't feel quite so alone. Montana's mornings arrived in layers of mist and gentle chill, painting the world in blue and silver. Emily found herself waking earlier each day, roused not by alarm, but by the quiet anticipation that now lived beneath her ribs. She slipped on boots still too big for her feet, jacket zipped to her chin, and hurried out to the paddock, her sketchbook pressed to her chest. The world outside was hushed, only the low murmurs of horses and the wind moving through the grass. Rust waited by the far corner, just a shadow against the fence, his head lowering as she approached. He watched her with cautious eyes, the tension in his body never quite melting away. Still, Emily noticed. Each morning, he stood a little closer to the fence, as if measuring his trust in inches. She settled herself in the usual spot, sketchbook open, knees curled up, and began to draw. The routine became a slow dance, her presence quiet and gentle, his movements wary but curious. Some days, he grazed near her, snorting at the sound of graphite scratching the page. Other times, he kept his distance, pacing slow circles, always with one eye on the girl and her book. Jack, always nearby, watched with quiet pride. He cleaned the stalls and mended fences, whistling old country tunes that seemed to keep the ghosts at bay. Once, as he passed, he murmured, "You're earning his trust. One sunrise at a time. Not many folks have the patience for that." The days stretched and softened, each one blending into the next. Emily's sketches filled page after page, not just of Rust, but of the mountains rising behind him, the golden sea of grass, the shifting light at dusk. She began to notice the subtle rhythms of the sanctuary, the way the air smelled different after rain, how the ground trembled softly beneath a herd at full gallop, how Rust's breathing slowed when she sat quietly close. It was the small details that anchored her. The first time Rust let her hand rest on the fence just inches from his muzzle, he flared his nostrils, sniffed her fingers, and didn't shy away. Emily's heart hammered, but she forced herself to remain still, her breath even, eyes soft. It was enough. She learned to see his moods in the flick of his ears, the ripple of muscle beneath his coat, the way his tail swished when annoyed or curious. As weeks passed, the sharp edges of Emily's grief began to blur. Her nightmares, images of twisted metal, flashing lights, the scream of tires, came less frequently. When they did, she would sit up in bed, shaking, and reach for her sketchbook. Drawing Rust, the curve of his neck, the depth of his amber eyes, seemed to anchor her to the present. She started sketching other things, too. The sanctuary dogs asleep in the barn, a crow perched on a fence post, the wildflowers growing along the gravel path. One afternoon, a storm rolled in from the mountains, dark clouds piling up on the horizon. Emily sat beneath the awning of the barn, knees tucked to her chest, as rain drummed steadily on the tin roof. Rust sheltered under a lone cottonwood nearby, shaking water from his mane. Emily drew the storm, not just the shapes of clouds, but the feeling of restlessness that pulsed through the earth and through her own veins. Jack joined her, leaning against the barn wall. He offered her a battered thermos of hot chocolate, the kind with tiny marshmallows floating on top. "You ever think about writing again?" he asked gently, searching her face. Emily hesitated, pencil hovering mid-stroke. She remembered a time, before the accident, when she'd ridden her mother's mare across wide meadows, laughter echoing in the air. Now the thought felt distant, as if it belonged to someone else. Jack didn't push. He simply nodded, his eyes kind. "No rush. The horses know when you're ready." The rain slowed, the clouds tearing apart to reveal a pale slice of sky. Emily rose, brushing hay from her jeans, and wandered back to Rust's paddock. He stood at the gate, ears forward, watching her approach. She reached into her pocket, fingers finding another slice of apple. This time, when she held it out, Rust didn't flinch. He took it gently, lips brushing her palm, and for a moment, Emily felt a warmth spread through her chest. Not happiness, exactly, but something close. That evening, she sat on her bed, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, sketchbook open on her knees. She drew Rust over and over, experimenting with different shades, textures, even drawing him free and wild in the open plains. The image felt right, as if, in her art, she could offer him the freedom he'd always longed for. The house felt less empty now. Jack's laughter echoed in the kitchen. The dogs barked and played beneath the window. Emily listened to the sounds, letting them wash over her, letting herself believe that maybe she could belong here, too. And out in the paddock, beneath a Montana sky brilliant with stars, Rust lifted his head, nostrils quivering, as if searching for the girl who understood what it meant to be wounded and what it meant to begin again. The first true warmth of spring spread across Horizon Hills, melting the last patches of snow from the mountain shadows. Emily grew braver in her routines, letting her steps carry her farther across the sanctuary's rolling fields. With each sunrise, her connection with Rust became less of an experiment and more of a ritual. The fence between them felt less like a barrier and more like a narrow bridge, something they both crossed in their own careful ways. That morning, Emily carried her sketchbook and a small brush she'd found in the tack room. Rust watched her approach, muscles rippling with nervous energy beneath his scarred flank. Emily sensed the tension. It vibrated in the air like the hum of distant wires. She stopped just outside the gate and waited, letting her breath slow, her shoulders drop, showing him she meant no harm. Jack leaned on the far rail, saying nothing. He had learned to let silence do the work. It was the only way these wounds, the ones nobody could see, ever started to heal. Emily slipped into the paddock, keeping her movements deliberate and soft. Rust shuffled back a few steps, nostrils flared, but didn't bolt. Emily set her sketchbook down in the grass and crouched, making herself small, unthreatening. For a long time she just sat, her eyes on the horizon, hands relaxed in her lap. The wind tugged at her hair, carrying the clean scents of hay and new grass. Finally, Rust drew closer, step by cautious step, curiosity flickering in his amber eyes. Emily raised her hand, palm up, and waited. The moment stretched and shivered, fragile as spun glass. Then Rust stretched his neck, nostrils flaring, until his breath touched her fingers. She reached, barely touching his tangled mane, and for an instant, he froze, all his weight bunched as if ready to flee. But he didn't. His muscles shuddered beneath her hand, and Emily felt her own heart pounding in sympathy, her fingers trembling but steady. A memory flashed through her mind, bright and raw. The screech of tires on wet pavement, the sickening jolt of metal twisting. Her mother's scream cut off too soon. It came not as sound, but as a wave of sensation, fear, confusion, the world shattering into pieces she couldn't put back together. She flinched, drawing her hand away. Rust startled at the sudden movement, shying sideways, eyes rolling white, but didn't run. He shook himself, snorted, and after a long moment, returned to graze a few feet away. Emily sat back on her heels, struggling to steady her breath. Across the paddock, Jack watched with a complicated look in his eyes. Pride, sorrow, hope all tangled together. He'd seen enough loss in his lifetime to recognize the look on Emily's face, the kind that comes from seeing too much, too soon. Later, after the sun climbed high, Emily found herself in the barn, cleaning stalls with Jack. The work was simple, grounding, the scrape of shovels, the soft rustle of straw, the way the horses leaned against their stalls, curious and companionable. Jack didn't ask questions. Instead, he hummed an old tune, the kind that wound through the quiet like a balm. "Some things," Jack said at last, "can't be talked about. Not right away." His voice was gentle, almost a whisper. "But you're not alone, Emily. Not here." She nodded, grateful for the space he gave her, for the way he understood without needing words. In the afternoon, Emily returned to Rust's paddock. This time she left her sketchbook closed, tucking it under her arm as she slipped inside. She sat cross-legged in the grass, eyes closed, letting the sunlight warm her face. She listened to the sound of Rust's hooves moving through the clover, the rhythm of his breathing, the quiet life all around her. Minutes passed. Rust drifted closer, his presence heavy but somehow comforting. Emily didn't reach for him. Instead, she just existed beside him, their shared silence a strange kind of comfort. They were two beings marked by wounds, his on the outside, hers deep within, and for a while that was enough. A sudden noise, a door slamming in the distance, made Rust flinch, his whole body tensed, ready to flee. Emily opened her eyes and met his gaze, her own fear mirrored back at her. But instead of running, Rust stood his ground, tail swishing, as if he'd made the decision not to let fear rule him, at least not today. The moment felt sacred, both of them trembling on the edge of flight, but choosing to stay. Emily pressed a hand to her heart, feeling the beat settle. She knew there would be more hard days ahead, more moments when the past crashed in and left her gasping. But here in the hush of the paddock, with Rust's shadow stretched alongside hers, she found a kind of peace she hadn't known she was searching for. Jack watched from the fence, a faint smile softening his features. He saw what Emily could not yet name, that healing wasn't about erasing pain, but about learning to breathe through it, to sit with it, to allow another presence beside you in the silence. That night, as the sun slipped behind the mountains and the stars blinked awake, Emily lay in bed replaying the feel of Rust's mane beneath her fingers, the strength trembling just below the surface. She fell asleep holding that memory, a fragile lifeline connecting her to the world beyond her own grief. In the barn, Rust stood quietly, his ears pricked to every sound. But for once, he wasn't just waiting for the next threat. He was listening for the girl who sat in silence, for the promise that broken things could find comfort together, and for the hope that tomorrow they might sit a little closer. The day started bright, with sunlight cutting the last of the morning mist and the hills ringing with the laughter of meadowlarks. Emily spent the early hours beside Rust's paddock, sketchbook balanced on her knees, the Mustang standing so close now she could hear his steady breathing. He let her brush his mane in slow, gentle strokes. She felt the tension in his muscles, but he stayed, his trust given in small, hard-won doses. By afternoon, the air changed. The sky darkened with bruised clouds crawling over the mountains. The wind whipped wild and sharp, setting the prairie grass to dancing. Emily heard the low roll of thunder far off, a warning, deep and unsettled. Jack came up from the barn, face pinched with worry. "We've got a bad one coming, Em. Best get inside soon. The horses'll feel it before we do." Emily nodded, but her eyes kept drifting to Rust. The Mustang shifted, head raised, ears flicked forward, tail snapping at invisible flies. He was uneasy, his legs restless, the whites of his eyes flashing with each distant rumble. Emily closed her sketchbook, tucked it under her arm, and stroked his shoulder one last time before heading inside. But she couldn't stop glancing back. The storm built quickly, the sky turning nearly green, wind hurling dust against the windows. In the kitchen, Jack filled lanterns and double-checked the radio. "Power might go," he muttered. "This old place is stubborn, but it's been through worse." Lightning split the sky. The sanctuary seemed to hold its breath. Emily's chest tightened with each crack of thunder. Rain pelted the roof, a steady drumbeat. Through the window she saw the horses in their corrals, some huddled beneath the lean-tos, others running in tight, anxious circles. Rust was alone, pressed against the far fence, his body tense as a coiled spring. A sudden, jagged flash lit up the sky, and with it, a terrible crash echoed from the paddock. Emily rushed to the window in time to see Rust slam against the fence, hooves striking wood, wild with terror. Lightning flickered again, throwing his silhouette large and frantic against the barn. "Stay inside," Jack barked, voice hard. "It's too dangerous." But Emily was already running, the world a blur of rain and fear. She burst from the kitchen, out into the storm, her boots slapping through mud. The wind clawed at her hair, stinging her eyes. Thunder crashed, rattling her bones. She reached Rust's corral, breathless, soaked to the skin. The Mustang careened along the fence, eyes rolling white, snorting and kicking at the rails. Emily climbed through the gate, heart thundering, hands shaking so hard she nearly dropped her sketchbook in the mud. "Emily!" Jack's voice was distant, nearly lost in the howl of wind. But she barely heard him. Her world had narrowed to the Mustang's terror, and her own memory, vivid and cold, of metal screaming and lives spinning out of control. She knew that panic. She lived with it every day. She moved slowly, arms out, trying to make herself as small and gentle as she could. "Easy, easy." The words came as whispers, thin and broken. Her voice felt unused, rusty with fear. Rust spun toward her, shivering, sides heaving. For a moment, he threatened to bolt, to trample her in his blind panic. But Emily stood her ground, eyes wide, hands open. The storm crashed and raged, lightning turning the world ghostly blue. She forced herself to breathe, to recall the feeling of Rust's mane in her fingers, the warmth of his breath. "It's okay. I'm here." Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried, through the storm, through the fear, through the wounds they both carried. Rust halted, legs splayed, nostrils flaring. Emily stood motionless, the rain washing her hair flat, her jeans sticking to her legs. Inch by inch, Rust stepped toward her, trembling from withers to tail. He lowered his head, breath snorting in her face, searching for some anchor in the chaos. Emily reached up, slow as sunrise, her palm facing him. "It's okay," she whispered again, her voice growing stronger with every syllable. Rust hesitated, then, with a shudder, pressed his forehead against her shoulder. His weight nearly knocked her off balance, but she steadied, wrapping her arms around his neck. For a few moments, they were a single island in the storm. A girl and a horse, both terrified, both refusing to run. The lightning flashed, thunder rolled, and still they stood. Emily felt his heartbeat pounding against hers, his breath warm through the cold rain. Jack arrived at the fence, breath ragged, boots caked with mud. He stopped short, awe breaking through his worry. He watched as Emily stroked Rust's neck, whispering over and over, "You're safe, you're safe," and saw the wild fear melt slowly from the Mustang's eyes. The worst of the storm finally passed, the thunder retreating into the hills. The rain softened. The sky split open to reveal bruised streaks of gold and lavender. Emily stood for a long time with Rust's head in her arms, both of them shaking, both of them changed. Later, inside the house, Jack wrapped Emily in a blanket. Silent with pride and relief, she sipped warm tea, her hands trembling less and less. Outside, Rust stood at the gate, calmer, waiting for her in the quiet aftermath. That night, as sleep crept over her, Emily remembered the feeling of his trust, heavy, real, and fragile as hope. She realized, as thunder echoed far away, that sometimes it's in the worst storms that the deepest bonds are formed. By the time the hills greened again and wildflowers began to paint the Montana fields, Emily and Rust had become something of a quiet legend at Horizon Hills. Their routines settled into rhythms that felt as natural as sunrise. Emily would sketch at dawn while Rust grazed nearby. Then together they'd circle the paddock, each day walking a little closer, a little braver. Jack watched them with an affection so deep it rarely reached his lips, but lived instead in the way he lingered at the window or kept a gentle eye on the paddock from the barn. It wasn't long before word of their bond drifted beyond the sanctuary fences. One morning, Jack's phone rang with a voice he hadn't heard in years, Dr. Sarah Miller, an equine behavioral specialist known for her work with traumatized horses and children. "Heard there's something special happening out there, Jack. Mind if I pay a visit?" Jack glanced at Emily, who'd gone still at the sound of a stranger's name, and then at Rust, whose ears were pricked toward the sound of a new truck rolling up the gravel drive. Dr. Miller arrived with little fanfare, jeans streaked with dust, hair in a messy braid, eyes kind but sharp. She approached quietly, observing Emily and Rust from a respectful distance before kneeling by the paddock and speaking softly. "He's a beauty," she said, not to anyone in particular, but to the wind and the wildness that seemed to live in both child and horse. Emily, uncertain, drew Rust's eye with a gentle flick of her wrist. Rust watched her, then surprised everyone by stepping between her and Dr. Miller, as if to say, "She's mine to trust." Dr. Miller nodded in approval. "I've seen connections like this only a few times in my career. It's not about breaking, it's about listening." Jack explained, his words measured, that Emily hadn't spoken out loud since she'd lost her parents. Dr. Miller just smiled. Words aren't always the language that matters. She spent the day with them, watching how Emily's movements drew Rust in, how a quiet hand on his shoulder soothed his shudders. "You two have something rare," she said at last, "and I'd like the world to see it." Dr. Miller proposed an idea. Emily and Rust should demonstrate their unique bond at the Montana State Fair, a showcase meant to inspire, not to perform tricks or push boundaries. Jack's face clouded with worry. He remembered the wildness that still lived under Rust's skin, the tremors in Emily's hands when things grew too loud. It's a lot to ask. Crowds, noise. It could undo everything. But Emily, for the first time, held his gaze, her eyes steady and determined. She closed her sketchbook and gave Jack a look that needed no words. It said, "I want to try. I want to show them." So the training began. Not in the way most horses are trained, with shouted commands or rope and bridle, but with gestures, patience, and the silent understanding they'd built together. Dr. Miller set up a small obstacle course in the back pasture, weaving poles, a narrow bridge, brightly colored tarps that flapped in the wind. The goal was simple: navigate it together, side by side, with nothing but presence and trust. At first, Rust shied from the poles, sidestepping the bridge. Nostrils flared at the flapping tarps. Emily never hurried him. She moved through the course herself, showing him each step, pausing to let him watch and decide for himself. If he balked, she waited. If he turned away, she circled back, always gentle, always patient. Days stretched into weeks, each one a lesson in trust, not just for Rust, but for Emily too. Sometimes Jack and Dr. Miller watched from a distance, murmuring to each other. "You see the way she moves?" Dr. Miller asked. "That's not fear, that's empathy. That's how healing begins." There were setbacks, of course. One day, a hawk swooped low over the field. its shadow sending Rust into a panic. He reared, nostrils flaring, nearly bolting through the fence. Emily, startled but calm, simply stood her ground, breathing slow, her hands open at her sides. She waited until Rust returned, trembling, then stroked his mane, her silence a promise. "I'll never force you. I'll always wait." Little by little, Rust learned to trust the course. And Emily. He let her guide him with a gentle touch, stepping carefully over the bridge, weaving through the poles with more grace each time. Sometimes she'd walk backward, facing him, and Rust would follow as if drawn by an invisible thread. As the state fair approached, excitement buzzed through the sanctuary. Local kids came by to watch, parents peering over fences, some with tears in their eyes. Jack worried aloud. What if the crowd spooks him? What if Emily freezes? But Emily answered him in her own way. She handed him a drawing. Herself and Rust side by side, sunlight streaming over them, a caption at the bottom in shaky pencil. "We'll do it together." The day before they left for the fair, Emily spent an hour alone in Rust's paddock, the sky turning pink with dusk. She pressed her forehead to his and breathed him in, the smell of dust and wild grass, of sweat and hope. For the first time since arriving at Horizon Hills, she felt something close to anticipation, the flutter of hope rising quietly inside her. In the hush before night, Jack watched them from the porch, pride and worry warring in his eyes. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he believed, in that moment, that whatever came next, Emily and Rust would face it, side by side. The air at the Montana State Fair pulsed with restless energy, laughter and shouts weaving with the distant hum of carnival rides, the scent of popcorn and sawdust thick in the heat. Emily had never been anywhere so loud, so crowded, so overwhelmingly alive. She held her sketchbook tight to her chest, tucked behind the fairground's livestock arena, while Jack fastened Rust's lead rope with hands that trembled more than he'd ever admit. Rust paced the makeshift pen, eyes wide, nostrils flaring at every unfamiliar noise. Announcements blared from overhead speakers. A nearby horse whinnied, shrill and panicked. The crowd pressed close, spilling over fences. Children perched on shoulders to get a better look at the mute girl and the wild Mustang they'd heard about on the morning news. Jack crouched next to Emily. "Remember, if either of you want to stop, we go home. I mean it." He tried for a reassuring smile, but his worry showed in every line of his face. Emily nodded. She pressed her hand to Rust's neck, feeling the tremor beneath his coat, the same fear that still sometimes shivered through her own bones. She drew a deep breath, steadying herself as Rust watched her, searching for his own anchor. Then, as if reading each other's minds, they stepped into the arena together. The lights seemed blinding, the crowd quieted, 100 faces leaning forward, expectant and curious. Rust froze just inside the entrance, head held high, eyes darting. Emily felt the old panic flare inside her. Memories of car horns, sirens, the sick rush of adrenaline. For a heartbeat, time slowed. Then Emily reached up, her small hand resting on Rust's neck. She didn't pull or urge, just let him feel her presence, solid, calm, familiar. She focused on her breathing, letting the noise of the crowd fade into the background, focusing on the steady rhythm of Rust's heartbeat under her palm. Slowly, Rust's breathing evened out. He looked at Emily, then flicked an ear toward the first obstacle, the line of weave poles painted bright blue and white. Emily stepped forward, gentle and patient. Rust hesitated, then followed, his movements uncertain but willing. Together they moved into the course. Emily walked the path, giving Rust space to choose, to pause, to gather himself. She never pulled, never forced. When Rust faltered, she simply waited, her body language an invitation instead of a command. The crowd murmured, then grew hushed, captivated not by spectacle, but by the careful dance unfolding before them. They made their way through the weave poles, Rust's hooves clipping softly on the dirt. At the narrow wooden bridge, Rust balked, muscles bunching, head tossed high. Emily stopped, turning to face him. She locked eyes with the Mustang, her own fear mirrored in his gaze. Then, quietly, she stepped onto the bridge herself, her boots echoing in the hush. She looked back, holding out a hand. For a long, breathless moment, Rust considered, ears flicking, eyes wide. Then, with a shaky exhale, he set a hoof on the bridge, then another, crossing to the other side with Emily at his shoulder. The audience let out a collective sigh, some clapping, others simply blinking back tears. As they reached the final stretch, a sudden cheer erupted from the far stands, a burst of applause that sent a ripple of tension through Rust's body. He shied, muscles bunched, ready to bolt. Emily dropped her sketchbook, turning toward him, hands open. She let the world fall away, her focus narrowing to the trembling horse before her. She stepped forward, pressing her hand firmly to Rust's neck, her breath coming in quiet, steady waves. He snorted, shaking, but his feet stilled. Emily closed her eyes, picturing every sunrise at Horizon Hills, every quiet moment beside the paddock fence. She felt the trust they'd built, a bridge strong enough to withstand even this storm. Then, softly, she turned and placed her foot in the stirrup. For the first time in public, she swung herself onto Rust's back, moving with practiced care. The crowd gasped, watching as she settled her weight, then leaned forward, hands gentle on his mane. Rust stilled, trembling, then took a hesitant step. Emily let him choose the pace, guiding only with her voice and presence. They circled the arena, slow, careful, no tricks or grandstanding. Just a girl and a horse, both battered by the world but moving together, each trusting the other to carry them through. When they completed the circuit, Emily slid to the ground, legs weak, face shining with sweat and something like wonder. The crowd erupted, applause thundering through the arena, camera flashes strobing the air. Jack wiped his eyes, overcome with pride. Dr. Sarah Miller, watching from the edge of the ring, pressed a hand to her heart. She leaned over to Jack. What they did today, it wasn't about the obstacles at all. It was about choosing each other, every step, no matter who's watching. Emily led Rust from the arena, heart pounding, Rust's head low and calm beside her. They passed through the gates and into the quiet behind the stands, the din of the crowd receding like a distant storm. Jack found them there, pulling Emily into a rough, tearful hug. You did it, kid. Both of you. As the sun set behind the fairgrounds, painting the sky in streaks of orange and gold, Emily sat in the grass beside Rust, sketchbook open. She drew the arena, not the crowd or the lights, but the tiny moment when Rust had chosen trust, and she'd chosen courage. That, she knew, was their real victory. The sky over the fairgrounds was streaked with lavender and rose, the evening settling like a hush after a day full of noise. The crowd still lingered along the fences, talking quietly, faces flushed with wonder from the scene they'd witnessed. Emily stood near the exit of the arena, Rust beside her, both trembling. Not with fear now, but with the aftershock of something enormous. Jack and Dr. Miller watched from just outside the ring, unwilling to break the spell. Someone handed Emily a microphone. The fair announcer, voice warm and gentle, knelt so his eyes were level with hers. "Would you like to say something?" he asked softly, careful not to crowd her. Emily froze, fingers gripping the microphone so tightly her knuckles went white. For a moment, all she could hear was her own heartbeat, roaring like a distant train. She stared at the crowd, then at Rust, who nudged her shoulder, his breath steady and warm on her cheek. Jack was there, just behind the fence, hands shaking. He'd seen Emily silent for so long, watched her world narrow to sketches and nods and the hush that grief leaves behind. The crowd waited, holding their breath as the girl and the Mustang stood together in the fading light. Emily felt the weight of everything, the fear, the loss, the nights spent whispering secrets to her sketchbook, the dawns in the paddock with Rust, the storm when she had stood her ground for him, the long afternoons learning how trust is a slow and gentle art. The silence stretched, full of possibility. Then quietly, her lips parted. At first it was only a whisper, a soft sound that seemed to vanish before it reached anyone's ears. She looked at Rust, then at Jack, who nodded, tears bright in his eyes. Emily swallowed, her courage gathering from somewhere deep inside, and tried again. He wasn't scared at all. Her voice, uncertain but clear, slipped into the microphone and echoed across the arena. For a heartbeat, the world stilled, time hanging in the golden twilight. Then Jack, unable to hold back, burst into tears. He clapped his hands together, laughter breaking through his sobs, relief and pride mingled on his weathered face. The audience erupted in applause, wild, joyful, uncontained. Some people wiped their eyes, others cheered, a few just smiled quietly, touched by something they couldn't quite name. Dr. Miller grinned, shaking her head in awe. She whispered to Jack, "This is what healing looks like. Two wounded creatures making each other brave." The fair announcer smiled, voice catching. "Would you like to tell us more, Emily?" Emily hesitated. She wasn't ready for more words. Not yet. But her answer was clear in the way she pressed her cheek to Rust's neck, the way she held the microphone steady. Sometimes one sentence is enough to turn a page. Afterward, strangers pressed forward to shake Jack's hand, to pat Rust's shoulder, to marvel at the quiet girl who had found her voice at last. Local journalists snapped photos. Parents held their children close, whispering that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is trust again. The arena emptied slowly, people carrying away the memory of what they'd seen. As dusk settled, Emily and Jack walked Rust back to the small stable set aside for visiting animals. The noise and lights faded behind them. Emily fed Rust a slice of apple, her hand steady. She stroked his mane, the bond between them stronger now than ever, something invisible, but unbreakable. In the stillness of the stable, Dr. Miller joined them. "You know, Emily, what happened out there? It wasn't about taming a horse. It was about learning how to be safe, together. About choosing presence over control." She smiled. "That's a lesson most adults haven't learned." Emily nodded. She couldn't quite find the words for the swirl of feelings inside her. Pride, relief, joy, exhaustion. But she knew she'd remember this night forever. Later, as Jack drove them back to the sanctuary, the silence in the truck felt different. Not heavy, not sharp, just quiet, like a deep breath after a long run. Emily traced the word trust on the fogged window with her fingertip, watching the dark shapes of the mountains roll by. At Horizon Hills, the horses stirred in their stalls, welcoming them home. Emily helped Jack settle Rust in his paddock. then lingered by the fence as stars blinked awake above the open plains. She pulled out her sketchbook, drawing the fairground arena, the bright lights, the cheering crowd, the tiny brave girl standing beside her Mustang. She wrote in the margin, in slow, careful script, "Trust grows not in control, but in patience and presence." Inside the house, Jack set Emily's drawing on the mantel, next to old photos of her mother on horseback. He understood, in that moment, that Horizon Hills had done its work, not just for a broken Mustang or a grieving child, but for himself, too. That night, as Emily fell asleep, her dreams were peaceful. She saw Rust running wild beneath an endless Montana sky, his scars softened by light. In her dream, she ran with him, free, unafraid, her voice strong as wind. Morning came gentle after the storm of the fair, sunlight streaming through lace curtains and painting Emily's walls with gold. The world at Horizon Hills felt different. Still the same rolling grass, the same calls of jays and meadowlarks, but the air was charged with a sense of possibility. For Emily, there was a new kind of quiet, a peace that replaced the heavy silence of grief. Jack bustled about the kitchen, humming as he flipped pancakes. On the table lay a fresh stack of letters and emails, donations, messages of support, and invitations from people who'd heard Emily and Rust's story. News crews arrived, their vans rumbling up the long gravel driveway. They set up cameras near the barn, careful not to spook the horses. Jack fussed over his flannel shirt, muttering about all this fuss, but his eyes sparkled with pride each time he watched Emily lead Rust out to greet a visitor. Articles appeared in local and national papers. Mute Girl and Mustang inspire Montana. Broken hearts heal together at Horizon Hills. The phone rang with requests for interviews, partnerships, and, most surprisingly, offers to support the sanctuary's mission. For years, Jack had struggled to keep the place afloat. Now, thanks to Emily and Rust, the world wanted to help. One warm afternoon, a new sign was hung on the old barn wall, painted by Emily herself. In tall letters it read, "Rust's Program, a place for second chances." The program would pair rescued Mustangs with children recovering from trauma, giving both horse and child the patient attention they needed. Dr. Saka Miller helped organize the first sessions, teaching volunteers how to read the language of frightened animals and hurting kids. The first group arrived on a Saturday, a shy boy who never met anyone's eyes, a girl whose hands fluttered anxiously at her sides, a tall teen with shoulders curled inward. Rust watched them all, ears flicking, tail swishing. Emily stood beside him, her own nerves humming. But she remembered that first day by the fence, the silence, the fear, the way Rust's curiosity had pulled her back into the world. They started small. Emily showed them how to sit quietly by the paddock, how to wait for a horse's attention, how to offer an apple on a flat palm. She drew sketches for them, of Rust's face, of a quiet hand, of the gentle curve of a Mustang's ear. The children watched, then tried for themselves. Sometimes Rust came forward, sometimes he didn't. Emily taught them that was okay, that patience was its own kind of courage. Jack and Dr. Tio Miller watched from the shade of the old cottonwood. "She's doing what her mother did," Jack whispered, voice thick. "She's teaching them how to be brave again, without ever raising her voice." As the weeks passed, the barn walls filled with Emily's drawings. Horses running free, children laughing, the wide Montana sky above. The sanctuary, once barely surviving, now buzzed with life and laughter. Volunteers painted new stalls and fixed old fences. Donors sent books and brushes, apples and art supplies. Some families traveled across the country, hoping their child could find what Emily had, a way to trust again. One golden evening, Emily and Jack painted a mural across the side of the big barn. The mural showed Rust running wild under a limitless sky, his scars almost hidden by the blaze of sunset. Next to him, children stood, some smiling, some quiet, all with hands open and unafraid. Beneath the scene, Emily wrote, "Freedom without fear." Later, Emily stood back and studied her work, her hands covered in paint. She remembered the first night at Horizon Hills, when hope had felt as distant as the mountain peaks. Now, every inch of the sanctuary spoke of healing. The clatter of hooves at dawn, the bright laughter of children, the warm, soft nuzzle of a grateful Mustang. Jack called her to the porch, where he'd laid out glasses of lemonade. The sun dipped low, turning the plains to amber. Emily sat beside him, silent, but not with sorrow. Jack squeezed her hand. "Your mother would be so proud," he said, his voice rough. "You built something here. You gave us all a second chance." For the first time, Emily believed it was true. That night, after the volunteers had gone and the children were sleeping in their bunks, Emily slipped outside. She walked the silent paths beneath the stars, past the corrals and out toward the big barn. Rust stood by the mural, grazing in the moonlight. Emily stroked his mane, breathing in the sweet scent of grass and summer air. She opened her sketchbook and drew by starlight, capturing the curve of Rust's neck, the endless sweep of sky. In that moment, she understood. Healing wasn't a destination, but a journey walked together. Some wounds faded, others remained, but the legacy of Horizon Hills was written not in scars, but in the gentle, everyday acts of trust and hope. As the sanctuary quieted, Emily sat with Rust beneath the mural. She looked up at the stars and whispered, "Thank you," to her parents, to Jack, to Rust, and to the land that had given her back to herself. She didn't need applause or headlines. The greatest legacy was here, in the freedom to hope, to trust, and to dream again beneath the wide Montana sky. Montana autumn settled in with cool mornings and the gentle rustle of aspen leaves, turning the hills around Horizon Hills Sanctuary to gold. The world outside seemed to move a little slower, as if savoring the last light before winter. Emily awoke to the familiar rhythms, Jack's voice humming through the kitchen, the distant thunder of hooves, and the soft, steady breathing of Rust just outside her window. But something about this day felt different, charged with quiet meaning. For weeks now, visitors had come from all over. Parents and children, teachers, neighbors, even strangers who'd read about Emily and Rust in the news. Local reporters visited again, eager to see the progress of Rust's program. Emily, once wary of attention, now moved among the crowds with a calm assurance that had grown in her like a tree taking root. She guided small groups through the paddocks, showing them how to sit in the quiet, how to let the horses come to them, how to listen for the language of trust. One evening, Jack gathered the community for a special event. He set up chairs in the big barn, lanterns casting pools of light along the walls painted with Emily's mural. People brought potluck dishes, casseroles, pies, sweet tea, and sat shoulder to shoulder, their voices warm and low. When it came time for Emily to speak, Jack squeezed her hand and whispered, "Just tell them what's true." Dr. Miller smiled from the front row, her eyes shining. Emily stood at the makeshift podium, her notes shaking slightly in her hands. Rust stood just outside the barn, head poking through the open doors, as if waiting for his cue. Emily glanced at him, found her center, and looked out at the faces before her, familiar and new, young and old. She took a breath, letting it settle her. For the first time, her voice carried strong and clear through the barn. I used to think healing meant fixing what was broken, that if I was quiet enough or careful enough, I could erase the things that hurt. But healing isn't about forgetting or pretending the scars aren't there. It's about standing beside them until they soften. She paused, searching the crowd, watching the way people listened. Rust taught me that. He showed me it's okay to be afraid, to move slow, to trust again 1 inch at a time. I couldn't have found my voice without him, or without all of you who believed in us. The barn was silent, not with tension, but with hope, each person feeling the weight and truth of Emily's journey. Emily glanced down at her notes, then set them aside. We built Rust's program for every person and horse who needs a place to heal. If you ever meet someone, person or animal, who changes you just by trusting you, I hope you'll share your story. You never know who might need to hear it. Her words hung in the air, simple but powerful. From the doorway, Rust whickered softly. The children in the audience giggled, waving to him. Emily smiled, feeling the warmth ripple through the barn. Jack stepped forward, hugging Emily tight. "You did good, kid," he whispered. "Your mother would have loved this." Later, as the crowd spilled out into the starlit night, people lingered by the paddocks, sharing stories, some of loss, some of hope, all touched by what they'd witnessed. Dr. Miller took Emily's hands. "You've given people a gift, Emily. Your courage reminds them they can heal too." Reporters wrote articles about the evening. Videos of Emily's speech spread across the internet, reaching others who had never even seen a Mustang or the rolling plains of Montana. Letters and emails poured in from as far away as New York and California. Strangers sharing their own stories of pain and resilience, of animals that saved them, of kindness received when it was needed most. As the season shifted, Rust's program grew. More Mustangs arrived, each with their own story, each finding a gentle hand and a patient heart. The children kept coming, sometimes shy, sometimes angry or afraid, but always leaving a little lighter. Volunteers painted new barns, planted wildflowers along the paths, and told visitors about the girl who had once lost her voice but found it again beside a wild horse. On the last warm day before the first snow, Emily walked the fields with Rust, watching the light change. The world hushed and golden. She stopped at the crest of a hill, looking out at the sanctuary, the barns, the paddocks, the laughter floating up from the yard. She pressed her forehead to Rust's, their breath mingling in the crisp air. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice carried away on the wind. Not just to Rust, but to everyone who had stood with her. Jack, Dr. Miller, the children, the land itself. That evening, Emily wrote in her journal, a letter she hoped others might read one day. If you've ever met someone, person or animal, who changed you just by trusting you, tell that story. It matters. It's how the world heals. As the first flakes of snow drifted down, Emily and Rust stood together, quiet and sure, beneath a sky vast enough for every hurt and every hope. Horizon Hills had become more than a sanctuary. It was a beacon, a place where trust grew, wounds softened, and every voice, no matter how small or silent, could finally be heard.